Okay, so this is example 2 of 3 for task 4A, another comparison-focused analysis. Take note of how different this analysis is from the other comparison-focused analysis. In this case, the arguments both have definite conclusions, but said conclusions oppose each other. Let me clarify what I mean by conclusions oppose each other. So if you're going to claim at some point that your conclusions oppose each other, that means in a case like this one says, I do not think it is possible to prove. This one says, I do think it is possible to prove. I don't want you to say that if you take a definite position, but someone says it's not rational to take a definite position, that your conclusions oppose each other. There's the implication, it is implied that you think it's rational to take a definite position, but that's not the conclusion you are actually arguing for. You just took your definite position. So if you are selecting, or if you yourself have the conclusion that it was not rational to take a definite position, but your peer did take a definite position on the matter of free will and wearing a mask in the grocery store, then you can just say that we had different conclusions. But this is what I mean by opposing conclusions. The opposing will mean with respect to definite conclusions. Okay, so the word count for the analytical paragraph only is 296. Outstanding. I meant to erase the A-level comment there. The grade or score would be 90 to 95 points. I already went over all of this, so I'm not going to repeat that here in this video. Notice here that how they introduced the quoted material. This is what I prefer. I like it when you insert the names here. So remember, you should insert your own text first and then your peers. And by the way, if for some reason you skipped straight to the examples or skipped a lot of videos, keep in mind that in other videos, I go over requirements and give you warnings and tips that are not provided in writing anywhere and that I don't go over at all in this video, either in writing nor via this, what I'm saying now. Okay, so I'm going to not repeat what I already said in the first example video to keep things succinct. So hopefully you took really good notes with the first example video. Okay. So again, we see here one thing that our arguments have in common, albeit for opposing conclusions, regards our attention to scientific inquiry. So notice that in this comparison, they are going to focus on what they have in common in terms of what they gave attention to, right? It's not focused on definitions, it's focused on the focus of their reasoning. And so here we see that we get the gist, just the gist, which is scientific inquiry. So again, you don't have to state the whole thing. You don't want to get into a discussion about what you mean by scientific inquiry yet. If you're giving the gist in your first claim, do not start the discussion yet. First, make sure you do step 3B, which is what? Present your quoted material. Okay, so let's go ahead and work through this example just a little bit. As with the other example, I'm going to highlight how the student is meeting requirements for this task. So let's see, I used, so green then blue. So here you can see they follow this expectation here. So we're going to put that in green, which you can do as well. Make sure that if you do highlight, use really bright colors or faded colors like pastels. Their colors to avoid would be those that make it hard to read the text. So stick to, let me show you my screen right here. If you do highlight to show that you are following the steps for step 3A and 3B of page 2 of the assignment document for step 1 of task 4A, don't use yellow because yellow might have already been used by you or a peer in following the directions for this item response. You can use like this light green or light blue, but don't use colors that are too dark. Obviously, you wouldn't use black. Don't use dark gray. I guess you could use light gray. If you are using a word processor that allows you to pick more faded colors, I prefer faded colors. Obviously, you wouldn't pick that. Really, you wouldn't want to use any of these other ones. I won't be able to see what you're saying, so don't use any of these other ones. You'd have to use the light green and the light blue. If your word processor has other faded pastel colors, you could use those as well, but that's up to you. But I prefer that you stick to the same color scheme. So you could use light green to show that you're following the expectations for the first sentence, and then light blue to show that you're following expectations for the sentence or sentences that immediately follow. So here, we would go ahead and put here, okay, so we already went over this part, and this part right here, of course, should not be in green. Okay, so again, notice the introductory clause. We see this when I cite. So again, I would have liked when introducing the evidence, she said, when I, Daphne, cite how, and then she's not quoting a quotation. She's not quoting something quoted. In other words, something that she herself quoted. I know that you quote the entire response here, but they're not, here, Daphne's not quoting something that she quoted within her original response. So there's just the basic quotation, opening quotation marks. Don't forget the closing quotation marks. So we see this when I cite blah, blah, blah. And then she says, in your argument, we see this when you say. So notice these two examples of nice introductory clauses, ways to introduce quotes from your peers. And notice the examples that I'm giving you of statements and how we're using the word statements, or how you can quote a significant portion of a statement. So she says here, notice this example. In your argument, we see this when you say to prove something. So she might not have pulled from the entirety of the statement in each of these quotes, but she pulled enough from the statement to capture a complete thought and for the sentence as a whole, including the introductory clause for each piece of quoted evidence to make sense, right? What sometimes students do is they'll introduce their quoted piece, but then when you read the sentence as a whole, there's never a complete thought. So you've got to make sure that there is a complete thought that is present within the sentence as a whole where you're presenting your evidence. Okay, so then this part, we're going to go ahead and put this in light blue. Okay, so again, visually, I want to call your attention to how much work is done to achieve an A-level response to score at least a score of 90 to 95. Notice that there's more words, but like I said, number of words itself doesn't guarantee anything. Somebody could write less words and make a higher grade than somebody who writes more words, but doesn't perform according to the standards in the rubric and the expectations I've gone over in writing in this video. Look at all the additional sentences and thinking, objective analysis that is necessary to back up what you say in blue, right? What are you saying in blue here? This is evidence of something. In this case, a comparison, right? Look at how much work is done to show this. Look at how much unpacking there is. When you're unpacking what is blue, sometimes, when you're unpacking your textual evidence, sometimes you're able to stay focused just on what's in your evidence. Sometimes you have to connect what is in your textual evidence to other claims, other ideas that your peer gives in their argument. So know that that is okay and might even be necessary. All right, so let's go ahead and read through this. This video should not be as long as the first one because I didn't repeat stuff that I already covered in the first one. So notice that you can say things like, I think, right? So I think, because you are giving your own interpretation. You're not giving me mere opinion. You're not just making stuff up. It's based on textual evidence. And also notice that in all of the examples, the student never says, I agree or disagree. They don't do any evaluation. They don't say your response is good or bad. They don't say you didn't follow the instructions, or I did follow the instructions. There should be none of that language there, right? Nothing about agreeing or disagreeing. Notice in all of the examples how they're really focusing on something that was written on the past. They're focusing on what was said in this moment of time. Again, as I warned you earlier, what some students do is they'll start arguing about the topic itself. Here, the topic is about whether or not we can prove any claims about wearing the mask are true. In none of these examples is the student continuing that conversation. No, this conversation is a step above that. It's analyzing what you each thought about that. It's not discussing the topic itself. The topic is, how did you each respond, and was there a comparison, and if so, on what basis do you support that claim, and etc. Okay, so I think that's a hedge, wonderful to use. I think it is my interpretation. It is my view. My analysis shows, my analysis of our arguments shows, or leads me to think, or leads me to believe that. I think that your use of research, so remember what I said about putting words in quotation marks? You do that when you want to mention a word and talk about a word, but you're not using the word. So here they're talking about the word research, right? That's why it's in quotation marks. In your statement, so they're unpacking their peer's statement, captures not only what we both refer to with the word experiments, but also with what I'm referring to when I use the words test and studies. So the student is trying to unpack how the quoted material, the words in the quoted material, really do show that there is a comparison, a similarity. Okay? Hence, they're going to draw a minor conclusion here in support of what's here in blue, which is an implied conclusion, which is supporting what's in green, the main conclusion. Hence, there are some grounds for saying we both show attention to activities humans can have or engaged in to determine the truth about some concern, topic, or problem, including things like viruses and pandemics. Now, notice that the word hence is being used to draw a conclusion. In other words, they think they have sufficient support for what they're going to say after this. I'm not saying you have to have that. I'm not saying you have to have a minor conclusion in this part of your reasoning for what you say in green and in blue, but I'm showing you that that is possible. That said, make sure that you understand that hence is always a conclusion indicator. Sometimes students will just use the word hence, but they don't use it properly. And notice that there's a lot of interpretation going on in this sentence right here, right? They are interpreting the meaning of the word experiment, test, and studies while keeping in context the whole of each of their arguments to draw a conclusion, right? To support an interpretation. And what is interpretation? They both show attention to activities humans can or have engaged to determine the truth or concern of some topic. That is the student's interpretation of how specific words in each of their quoted materials have something in common. Okay, now consider that Google defines science as the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of nature and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experience. So this student has decided that to really argue for the similarity, to further tease out what she's already argued for, that she's going to use an argument and incorporate a argument within her argument, and that is an argument by definition. So here she wants to make sure that they both have a common understanding of what science is. In other words, she's saying, I'm not just going to give you my mere opinion as to what science is, because remember, that's the gist of her claim of their comparison, that they both show attention to scientific inquiry, correct? So she's like, here's an objective authority, right? And notice that, of course, she puts quotation marks around the word science because she's not using it. She's talking about it. She has a nice introductory clause. She uses quotation marks so that she doesn't plagiarize. There are major penalties for plagiarizing. What the student didn't do is they should have included a URL that leads me specifically to that definition for science. So that might be a deduction. With this definition for science in mind, so notice the nice transitions. So they say, now consider that Google defines. That's what you call a nice transitional phrase, but it's also a transitional phrase that says, hey, I was talking about words in our statements for arguing that there's a comparison, but now I'm going to transition to a definition I want to use. And then notice this nice little transition. With this definition for science in mind, so this is what I'm thinking of as a transitional sentence. There's a lovely flow from one part of the argument to the next. That is what? The argument in support of that. This really does count as evidence in support of the claim that there really is a comparison. All right, so then they are going to use the definition. So if you do mention a definition, if you cite it, then make sure that you use it. With this definition for science in mind, it is not unreasonable for me to claim, this is what you call a hedge. This is lovely. You might want to use this. This just shows that, you could be wrong. There could be other interpretations. Somebody might raise an objection, but you're saying this is what you've come to believe based on your analysis. It is not unreasonable for me to claim. In other words, I have some reason to believe, I have some evidence that we both use terminology relevant to science. What terminology are they talking about? Research, test, and studies. The terminology having to do with protocols and sense-making used by scientists. So notice how they're not merely repeating. So here's another warning, write it down. They're not merely repeating what they each said, and that's another mistake that some students make. All they do is repeat over and over again the statements they quote, or they merely paraphrase the original arguments without adding anything new. This is extremely important. This video is going to be a little kind of longish. You shouldn't repeat too much or merely repeat. Let's put it that way. It's okay to repeat something in different words to make the meaning clear, but do that only once for whatever it is that you're making clear. This part of the paragraph needs to be adding new insight, new understanding to what it is that you're talking about in the sense of, your claim, to the quoted material, right? You're adding insight, information as to what this evidence shows, what the quoted material in blue shows. Now, the statement I cited above from my response is only partial. The rest of it reads, so this is showing you how it might be appropriate to quote more from your responses, but notice how the quote is being used to reinforce the use of these quotes in blue to support what is in green. The rest of it reads, but the results are almost always inconclusive. Here we see more terminology in my response that is typical of how scientists talk. Results and inconclusive. While I might never use the word science at any point in my argument like you did in support of your conclusion, I think that my combined use of test, studies, experiments, results, and inconclusive shows that I was thinking of a scientific inquiry and hence its specific protocols. Wow, this is a great response.